The land began long before the fences. It breathed in golds and browns, rolled like an old hymn, hummed through cracked lips, and bore no apology for its silence. Prairie grass bent in the breeze with a sound like dry paper. Cottonwood trees stood alone, sentinel and stubborn, their leaves trembling under the endless, godless stretch of summer sky. Every so often a hawk cut across the blue, a dark motion slicing the stillness above. Below it all, riding with the weight of patience, was Samuel Eberly. He did not lean into the saddle like a man in need of a rival. He sat straight, boots steady in the stirrups, the reins held loose in one gloved hand. His horse, a dark roan named Abel, moved slow, the way old animals do when they know there is no chase, only the rhythm of watching and being watched. Eberly scanned the fence lines without hurry, one post down, another leaning. It would be fixed tomorrow or the day after. The land could wait. The Eberly spread ran from the shallow creek in the south all the way to the iron hills where lightning struck in summer. Cattle moved like scattered thoughts across it. Their lowing carried faint on the wind. The house stood far from the road, an old two-story built when Eberly's father still believed in permanence. The paint had faded from its bones, and vines now curled up its legs like forgetful hands. Eberly dismounted near the barn, dust lifting from his boots. He paused, listening, not for anything in particular, but because silence was never truly empty. There were sounds beneath it, the shuffle of hooves, the flap of pigeons in the loft, the slight creak of a weathered hinge. He waited until even those passed. Then he walked inside. Mira Boone had arrived at dawn 3 weeks earlier. The sky was bruised with morning cold, and frost still clung to the windows. She came in a wagon driven by old Jess Neely, who said nothing as he helped her down. Eberly was already in the barn feeding calves and did not look up when the wagon rolled in. He emerged only when the hooves stopped. She wore a blue shawl too thin for the season. Her hands trembled when she folded them. Her face, pale but not sickly, held the fragile calm of someone long accustomed to being looked at with pity, or worse. Eberly nodded once. That was all. No kiss, no greeting, no introduction to the ranch hands. Just a nod and a long pause and the silent understanding that she would enter the house now. The back door, the kitchen. There would be wood to stack and pans to scrub and chickens to feed. Eberly had cleared a room on the second floor, not the master bedroom, not yet. Her name had never appeared in the county paper, and no preacher had been seen walking up the porch steps. But in the small towns that fed off the dust and cattle of the West, word had its own way of moving. In town, they said Samuel Eberly had lost his mind. A girl from the Painted Spur, a place near the freight line where songs and sins were bought for coin. That's where she came from. Not a local girl fallen on hard times, but a stranger with no kin and no dowry. The kind who didn't wear gloves to church and never sat near the window. Men spoke of her with quiet curiosity. Women did not speak of her at all, except once. At the dry goods store, 3 days after Mira arrived, young Anna Lee Carter passed her on the street and let out a short gasp. Mira, clutching a basket to her chest, turned her face down. Anna Lee said nothing, only whispered to her sister as they passed, and walked on with careful disdain. Mira did not return to town for 2 weeks. She moved around the house as though she feared waking a sleeping beast. Her footsteps were muffled, her chores performed with the reverence of one making restitution. Dishes gleamed, floors no longer creaked. A kettle of sage tea waited every evening, the scent curling through the parlor like something half-remembered. She spoke only when needed. Mostly she listened, to the wind, to the chickens, to the old clock ticking above the hearth. Her voice, when heard, was soft, not meek, but careful, like rain that doesn't know whether it's welcome. Eberly watched her from a distance, not like a jailer, and not quite like a husband. He'd speak to her sometimes. All was in the fewest words required. "Fences broke. Storm tonight. You seen the brown calf?" She'd nod or answer simply. He never asked where she came from. She never offered. They ate dinner at the same table, not quite across from one another, he at the head, she near the side window. Sometimes their hands moved toward the salt dish at the same time, and then paused. Once, when a cold wind slipped in through the chimney, she draped her blue shawl over his shoulders. He didn't look at her, just let it rest there for a long moment before folding it and setting it on the bench beside him. On the 12th evening, she found the mare. One of the young ranch hands, not knowing her quiet manner, had left the gate open. The horse had spooked and caught her leg between two rocks near the creek. The others wanted to put her down. The break was too bad, they said. Eberly came down with his rifle, but Mira was already kneeling beside the animal, her hands on the mare's neck, whispering something no one else could hear. Eberly watched her for a long time. Then he handed the rifle back to the ranch hand. "Leave her," he said. "She's hers now." Every day after that, Mira tended to the mare. She named her Junia, bathed her, brushed her, wrapped the broken leg with torn sheets dipped in vinegar and honey, sat beside her for hours under the cottonwood shade, a book open but unread in her lap. The mare's breathing slowed. Her panic faded. Even when pain laced her movements, Junia no longer bucked or cried out. In time, she stood again, shaky, crooked, but alive. No one said much about it, but they noticed. The prairie wind moved differently that month, slower, heavier. It carried not just dust, but something older, an unspoken agreement that people could change, or that they could endure, which in the end was almost the same thing. Samuel Eberly, for all his wealth and cattle and acres of land, said nothing of what he'd done. But every morning now, he left the kitchen with a second mug of coffee. He'd set it near the barn door, where Mira came before sunrise. Some mornings it was still hot when she found it. Some mornings it wasn't. Still, she drank every drop, and the land went on breathing. The mornings on the Eberly land came slow, as if the light had to think twice before touching the earth. First, the frost withdrew its claim, one brittle blade of grass at a time. Then the sky softened from black to pewter to pearl, a pale glow stretching thin across the flat horizon. Roosters called half-heartedly. Somewhere the lowing of cattle echoed off the foothills, muted by distance and cold. The world stirred not because it wanted to, but because it had always done so. Mira rose before the light. She moved barefoot over the plank floor, careful not to wake the wood. Her hands, red with scrubbing and wind, folded blankets with practiced grace. A thin shawl wrapped around her shoulders, no longer the blue one, which now hung near the mare's stall, but a faded green quilt she'd patched herself. Her breath fogged in the air. She paused at the window. The land outside lay like a slumbering beast, familiar now, though not yet friendly. Junia, the broken-legged mare, stood in a lean-to behind the barn, her weight uneven but held with quiet dignity. Mira approached her with a tin pail of warm mash, her movement slow and low. She hummed, not a tune she remembered, but one she invented in rhythm with her steps. The mare lifted her head. There was no whinny, no sound, only a flick of the ears, a subtle lean forward, and then eating. That was enough. After the mare was fed, Mira turned to the other chores. Chickens needed letting out. Water had to be boiled. Clothes had to be beaten clean with stones at the creek's edge, even when the water numbed the bones of her fingers. No one told her to do these things. She simply did them. She had lived in places where action was the only currency, where kindness without request was a strange thing. On the ranch, it was not expected, but it was noticed. The hands stopped swearing when she passed. The cook in the bunkhouse left extra biscuits on a plate by the gate. Someone mended the front steps after she tripped on one. They did not speak to her, but they began in small ways to see her. Samuel Eberly remained as constant as a granite ridge. He woke at 4, fed the calves, met with ranchers or bankers, rode the fence line, smoked once before supper, and retired with a lantern and ledger. He did not ask where Mira spent her hours, nor did he question the sudden order in the kitchen, or the folded linens, or the soft hum of a song in the hallway. But some nights, just before extinguishing the light, he would glance across the narrow hallway, to the door she now slept behind. Not long, just a glance, as if listening for something he'd never learned to hear. Mira's presence in the house changed it, not all at once. At first, the dust simply moved from one place to another, but then the air began to carry warmth that was not fire-borne. The table by the entryway bore a small clay pot with late-blooming chamomile. A pair of mended lace curtains hung over the east window, cut from a dress she no longer wore. The iron stove was polished until its surface mirrored shapes more than shadows. Still, she walked like a tenant, never barefoot in common rooms, never sang aloud, never asked for things, until the day the kettle cracked. It was a plain thing, iron and heavy, passed down through the Eberly line. It split clean across the bottom while boiling water for stew. Mira stood over it with her hands in her apron pockets, waiting. When Eberly came in from the barn, she met him at the door. Her voice was even. "It's broken." He glanced at the kettle, then at her. "You want another?" She nodded, not with hope, just with fact. He left at dawn the next day for town. Returned with a new kettle, enameled, blue, finer than she needed. She did not thank him aloud. But that evening, she served stew with a rosemary sprig floating on top. He noticed, said nothing. That was their rhythm. The first snow came early, thin, almost ashamed. It laid itself down in crooked lines like old lace abandoned in a field. Mira stood at the back fence and watched it fall. Her breath plumed in front of her, slow and still. Junia stepped beside her, hobbling softly on her healing leg. Mira did not reach out, but the mare leaned in anyway, pressing her weight gently to Mira's side. Neither moved for a long time. Sunday mornings brought church bells faintly over the hills, but they were too far for the ranch to hear them clearly. Mira heard them anyway, in the stillness that came when the ranch paused, when the world held its breath and waited for the divine to notice. One Sunday, Eberly brought out the wagon. He said nothing, just waited by the steps. Mira emerged in a gray wool coat, her hands gloved, a ribbon in her hair. She climbed in beside him. Their shoulders did not touch. In town, the church loomed plain and white against the drab sky. Inside, wood creaked, eyes turned, pews shifted. Mira kept her gaze low. She walked with careful steps, took a place in the last row. Eberly stood beside her. He did not sit, he did not pray, but he stayed. When communion came, she did not rise. When the offering plate passed, she folded her hands in her lap. And when the preacher's wife turned at the door and looked directly at her, looked through her, and then offered her hand only to Eberly, Mira did not flinch. She only stepped aside, the way smoke leaves a room. Back at the ranch, she returned to the henhouse. She scattered feed slowly, each grain falling like time passing. Eberly stood on the porch for a while, watching the sky. Then he went inside and placed a chair beside the fireplace where there had been none before. The next morning, she sat in it, only for a moment, just long enough to leave a fold in the cushion. Out beyond the house, the land had not changed. The cottonwoods still trembled when the wind pushed through. The fence still leaned in places. The hills still watched, distant and unmoved. But something beneath the soil had shifted, as if the land itself had begun to listen. The wind changed in October. It no longer carried the dry heat of summer or the damp hush of early snow. It came thin and restless, tugging at the eaves, whispering through the prairie like someone searching for something lost. The cottonwoods shed their last leaves, bare branches creaking like old knuckles. Even the cattle moved differently, slower, closer to one another, as if bracing. Inside the Eberly house, the cold gathered in corners. The mornings were darker now, the sun rising late as though reluctant. Mira wrapped a scarf around her neck, wool socks on her feet, and moved through the house with a slower grace. The stove needed stoking twice as often. Pipes groaned, doors stuck in their frames. She did not complain. Some days the world outside vanished in fog, and the ranch became its own floating island, cut off from town, from history, from everything that had ever been. That was the morning she found the letter. She had been dusting the attic, not out of duty, but out of restlessness. The ladder was old, each step bowed with time. The air up there was dry and powdered with years of silence. A single window let in a narrow shaft of gray light. In one corner, beneath moth-eaten quilts and a cracked mirror, lay a trunk she hadn't seen before. Not a grand thing, not a keepsake chest, but a rough carpenter's box with a rusted latch. When she opened it, the scent of cedar and mildew rushed out, like breath held too long. Inside were papers, an old tobacco pouch, a woman's glove, and a folded scrap of blue fabric that had once been part of a dress. At the bottom, flattened between a hymnal and a ledger, was the letter. The ink was faded, the paper brittle. The folds had worn through in places, but the writing, small, deliberate, was still visible in parts. Dearest M, I don't care what they say. Names don't make a soul clean. I saw who you were in that quiet between songs. Come back if you ever need land under your feet. You have mine, always. S.E. She sat on the attic floor for a long time, the letter in her lap, the dust dancing in the angled light. She read it again, though it didn't answer anything directly. It felt more like a riddle than a truth. But her breath caught on the words, that quiet between songs, as if someone had reached into her chest and touched a place that had been closed. S. The initials could be anyone or him. She did not ask. That night she folded the letter and placed it in the pages of an old book she kept by her bedside, a novel with no ending, because someone had torn the last chapters out. The dreams returned after that, not nightmares, but memories twisted by sleep. Riverboats drifting under moonlight, laughter from behind velvet curtains, music rising from a parlor floor. A girl, not her, not quite, leaning out a window, watching lanterns bob down a midnight street. That girl wore no shame in her shoulders, no apology in her hips, but the music always stopped just before the voice called her name, and she always woke before hearing it. The townsfolk still watched her with the same mix of curiosity and coldness. Some days, when she came to buy flour or lye soap, a silence followed her like a second shadow. Children were pulled aside gently, eyes slid away. A woman at the post office once pretended not to see her standing in line, but things were not as they had been. The boy who delivered feed to the ranch now tipped his hat. The old farrier gave her a nod when passing. And once, at the general store, a young woman handed Mira a spool of thread she couldn't reach without a word, but without contempt. Small things, but noticed. One Sunday, Mira returned to the church alone. Eberly had stayed behind, tending to a cow that had fallen sick. She wore a simple gray dress, boots dusted with dried mud, her hair tied back. She sat again at the back, folded her hands in her lap, and listened. The sermon was about mercy, about the lost coin, the found lamb, the brother who came home. When the offering plate passed, Mira reached into her pocket and placed a single coin in it, a silver $50 she had kept from a time long before. At the door, the preacher looked her in the eye and said, "You're welcome here." His wife did not extend her hand. Mira nodded once, turned, and walked into the wind. That evening, Eberly came in with dirt on his coat and a scratch on his cheek. He nodded to her as he passed into the washroom, and she placed a towel on the hook for him. At supper, they sat as they always did, him at the head, her near the window. A moment passed. He said, "Preacher said something." She looked up. "He did. You believe him?" "I don't know yet," she answered. Eberly grunted softly. Then he passed her the butter without looking. Later, as the fire died low and shadows lengthened across the parlor walls, Mira took the letter from her book and unfolded it again. This time, she traced the words with her fingertip. She didn't know if Samuel had written it, and she wasn't sure it mattered. What stayed with her was not the name signed at the bottom, but the idea that someone once had seen her not for where she'd been, but for how she sat in silence, how she listened. And that maybe all this, the land, the house, the long hours between dawn and dusk, was not a penance, but a beginning. She folded the letter once more and placed it back in the book, not as proof, not as a keepsake, but as something to carry until she could stand tall enough to no longer need it. Outside, the wind pulled at the corners of the world, and somewhere in the dark, unseen and uninvited, her name passed through the cottonwoods, carried not with shame, but with a strange, quiet reverence. The birds left first. One morning, Mira stepped out with a pail of water, and the trees above her were silent. The sparrows that had nested under the eaves, the wrens in the cottonwood hollows, they were gone, not in flocks or farewell songs, just absent. She stood under the empty branches, her breath rising into the cold, and waited for a sound that didn't come. Winter had arrived, and with it, the hush that wrapped the prairie in slow, white stillness. Snow came in long, thin layers, soft as breath, until the land wore a white shawl of forgetfulness. Fence posts wore frost crowns. The creek glassed over, and cows huddled close for warmth, steam rising from their flanks like smoke. Mira's days shifted. She mended thick socks for the ranch hands, boiled lard soap in the yard, sewed new curtains from feed sacks. She salted meat, pickled beets, rubbed wax into the floorboards. Her hands, always working, bore new cuts, new burns. She didn't complain, she didn't need to. The house felt closer now, not smaller, just less hollow. Some nights Eberly returned from the fields with snow in his beard and sat a little longer by the fire. Mira brought tea with lemon rind. He took it without speaking, but their eyes met more often, a beat longer. A flicker of something still forming. Then came the gathering. Every winter, before the deepest snow, the ranchers from the surrounding valley met at the Eberly barn to weigh calves, barter hay, and prepare for leaner months. It had happened on this land for years, long before Mira, long before silence had moved into the house. The barn was swept clean, lamps hung from the rafters. Barrels of strong cider were rolled into place. Salted beef, loaves of bread, and wild honey were set on tables. Mira prepared most of it quietly, without instruction. The night of the gathering, snow began to fall again, fine, dry, windless. The valley men arrived wrapped in oilskin coats and wool scarves. Their breath came in clouds. Boots thudded on the packed earth floor. Laughter rolled out into the night air like thunder over the hills. Mira stayed near the stove in the far corner, ladling coffee into tin mugs. No one had asked her to come. No one had told her not to. She wore her gray dress, now let out slightly at the seams, and her hair pinned up simply. Her hands, red from the cold, moved quickly. For a time, no one looked directly at her. She was a fixture, like the stove or the beams or the steam rising from the food, something useful, unnamed. But then something shifted. One of the ranchers' wives arrived late, a woman named Ella Train, widowed for 4 years and known in the valley for the way she carried sorrow without bitterness. She entered in silence, her black shawl glittering with fresh snow. Her eyes swept the room and stopped when she saw Mira. Without hesitation, Ella walked to her. She placed her gloved hand gently on Mira's shoulder and said, just loud enough to carry over the room, "You belong." Mira froze, not from fear, from something deeper. A silence inside her cracked open. Ella gave a small nod, then took the mug from Mira's hand and turned to speak to someone else. The conversation resumed, laughter resumed, but Mira stood there unmoving, like someone remembering how to stand upright after years of hunching. Samuel had seen it. He had been across the barn, half listening to talk of cattle futures, when the moment happened. His eyes hadn't left her since. Later, when the guests had gone and snow had deepened along the fences, Mira remained in the barn, stacking unused plates, wrapping bread in cloth. Eberly stood by the stall door, watching her quietly. Then he said, "East pasture's been sitting a while. Grass is still good." She didn't turn around. I thought it was for the heifers. He stepped forward, took a small ring of keys from his coat, and set them on the table near her hand. Not anymore. She stared at the keys, said nothing, didn't touch them right away. He didn't explain, didn't offer meaning. He turned and left her there with the low flicker of lamplight and the soft hiss of falling snow beyond the walls. In the days that followed, Mira began riding out toward the east pasture. Junia, though still limping slightly, could carry her now. They moved slow but sure. The mare knew the land as if she had been born to it, and Mira let her lead. Out there, away from the main house, the silence was different, less heavy. The grass was yellowed but thick beneath the snow, the hills open, the air cold and honest. She found a spot near the edge of the fence where the wind always changed direction. There she built a small post from stacked stones. Nothing marked it. No plaque, no sign, just a place that was hers. Back at the ranch, Samuel began saying her name more, not often, not in conversation. But when he called across the yard, it was Mira, not hey or you. When he brought the horses in, he'd sometimes say, "Tell Mira the sorrel's acting strange." No one else said her name yet, but they'd heard it spoken. That mattered. On Christmas morning, it snowed again, thicker this time. The whole world white and weightless. Mira rose early, stoked the fire, and made coffee the way he liked it, dark, bitter, with a spoon of molasses. She placed the cup beside his chair and sat in hers. They didn't exchange gifts. Neither had ever expected any. But when Eberly came in from feeding the calves, he handed her a package wrapped in brown paper. No ribbon, just twine. Inside was a new pair of gloves, soft leather, small enough for her hands. She looked up at him, lips parted. He only said, "They'll last." She slipped them on. They fit. Outside, snow gathered on the rail fences, on the branches, on the roof. Inside, silence sat between them, no longer a stranger, not empty, just full of things not yet said. By spring, the snow was no longer white. It turned to slush at the edges of the fences, muddied with hoof tracks and the footprints of tired men. The sky softened its edge, blue returning in slivers between clouds. Cottonwoods, still bare, began to hum again, quietly, almost uncertainly, as if they too had forgotten how to hold green. The creek, once glassed over, now ran shallow and quick. Meltwater carved new paths through the pasture. Cattle wandered further from the pens, sniffing at the ground like they remembered something they hadn't touched in months. The birds came back too, not all at once, just a few at first, a pair of sparrows, a single hawk wheeling high in the sun. Mira noticed them before anyone else. She had taken to riding daily now, sometimes alone, sometimes with Junia walking beside her, a halter rope wrapped loose in Mira's hand. The mare still limped on cold mornings, but the limp no longer slowed her. It had become part of her gait, part of her way through the world. There was a kind of dignity in that. In the east pasture, Mira had begun tending to a patch of wild ground where the snowmelt ran long and clean. She planted nothing. But the soil had softened there. One day she found a small bloom, yellow and trembling in the breeze, and left it alone. It didn't need her hands to become something. Instead, she began placing things there, small offerings, a cracked horseshoe, a white stone from the riverbed, the broken handle of a butter churn. No one asked what the spot meant. It was hers. In town, the whispers had quieted. Ella Train now nodded to Mira from the dry goods counter. The preacher's wife still never spoke, but she no longer turned her face. One afternoon, a schoolteacher asked Mira if she'd ever taught handwriting. "You hold a pen like someone who learned it young," she said. Mira only smiled, didn't answer. Some parts of her would never be explained, not to others, not even to herself. That was all right. Back at the ranch, the house had begun to smell of soap and fresh bread again. The floors held warmth underfoot. Eberly came in more often during the day, not just to eat or rest, but to linger, for no reason other than the nearness of quiet company. One morning, Mira found a new saddle waiting in the barn. It was too fine for ranch work, stitched leather, light but strong, made for a woman's frame. She ran her fingers across the cantle. There was no note, but she didn't need one. Later that week, a child wandered into the ranch yard. A boy of about 10, dirt on his cheek, hair like sun-bleached hay. No shoes, no horse, just a knapsack and a nervous glance over his shoulder. The ranch hands saw him first. One started toward him, but Eberly appeared at the porch and held up a hand. Mira stepped outside. The boy looked at her like someone expecting to be sent away. He said nothing. She crouched down slowly, meeting his eyes. "You hungry?" He nodded. She held out her hand, palm up. He took it. The boy stayed only 2 days. Then a rider from town came for him, his father found drunk in a ditch, the boy having fled into the hills. Mira packed food in a cloth bundle and placed a new pair of boots under his arm. Before he rode off, the boy looked back once, then lifted a hand in the air, a simple wave. She stood in the road until he disappeared. It rained one night, hard and sudden. Lightning danced far out over the hills, and thunder rolled in slow, aching tremors. Mira sat at the window watching it all. The sky turned violet. The fields turned dark. Each flash revealed the world in frozen moments. Junia in her stall, the barn's outline against the storm, the porch railing slick with rain. Eberly stepped into the room behind her. His boots were wet. His shoulders carried the weight of 20 years of cattle and frost and land taxes. But in the lamplight, he looked like a younger man, or maybe just one who had learned how to be still. She didn't turn. He walked to her and placed something on the windowsill. It was the letter, the one from the attic, still folded, still faded. He didn't say it was his. He didn't have to. She nodded once. And they stood like that for a while. Two figures outlined by lightning, joined by something quiet and unspoken that had taken the shape of trust. The days grew longer. Chores changed. The earth smelled of thaw. Seeds were bought, fences repaired, tools sharpened. Then one morning, Mira rose before the sun, walked out into the pasture, and hung the blue shawl on the fence post. It fluttered gently in the breeze, not like something abandoned, not like something lost, like a signal, like a curtain lifted at the end of a long, silent play. Samuel came out onto the porch a little later, coffee in one hand. The door left swinging behind him. He looked toward the fence line, saw the shawl. He didn't smile, but he took off his hat and held it to his chest. Then he sat on the top step, watching the light creep across the grass. Mira stood beside the fence, eyes on the horizon. Her hands rested on the wooden rail, the same way they had once rested on Junia's neck, or a skillet handle, or her own heart when it threatened to break. Now they were steady. Behind her the ranch stirred to life. The dog barked once. A horse kicked a stall wall. Somewhere far off the church bell rang faintly. But she didn't move. She had risen, not by miracle, not by confession, not by penance. She had been lifted, slowly, silently, by the rhythms of land and labor, of trust offered without demand, and a man who spoke more through action than through promise. The shawl danced once more in the wind, and the land, the old, patient, watching land, breathed around her, full of sun and memory. She did not look back. She was already home.